Henry Emily is one of the most important characters in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. He's the co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, and he's the one who created almost all of the original Freddy Fazbear animatronics. But apart from that, he's obviously the one who helped put the original era of Five Nights at Freddy's to an end, starting the fight that burns everything to the ground in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. And while his story arc is simple enough, there's one huge problem that I see very few people in the theory space bring up: Henry's mysterious absence for about 30 years of the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. And since I'm currently in the process of making my own ultimate FNAF timeline, I knew this mystery needed to be solved. But before I explain what Henry Emily did during the 30 years he vanished off the face of the earth, we need to talk about Henry himself and what we know he did in the timeline. And the majority of what we know about him comes from FNAF 6 in the books, so that's where we'll look first. I'm WitheredCircle, and it's time to solve what really happened to Fazbear Entertainment co-founder Henry Emily, including whether he was blamed for the biggest set of murders in the FNAF franchise, and piece together an explanation that covers this weird mystery. I hope you enjoy, because today's theory might change your views on Henry Emily forever. Let's start with what we know about Henry. We were first introduced to the character of Henry Emily in the Silver Eyes novel trilogy, with the first book releasing in the late 2015. Note that these novels, unlike the novella collections, are explicitly stated to happen in their own universe, separate from the games. In the first book, The Silver Eyes, and the subsequent two installments, we find out that Henry Emily was a brilliant engineer who worked with entrepreneur William Afton to create Fazbear Entertainment, with the first establishment they created together in the novel timeline being Fredbear's Family Diner, with Henry Emily designing at least one of the Springlock suits, with Fredbear being his signature animatronic. Later on, when his daughter Charlotte Emily is killed by William Afton, Henry builds full robotic copies of his daughter that are meant to portray her aging, but ends up taking his own life shortly after. This is very clearly not at all what happens in the game's timeline, as we see Henry still very much alive in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, which happens decades after the death of his daughter. We also learn a lot about Henry for the two big pieces of dialogue he has in Pizza Sim, so let's begin by going over the first big speech we can hear from him in FNAF 6, the Insanity Monologue. If you purchase the Egg Baby attraction and put it in your pizzeria, if you restart the monitor during the night segments, you'll hear an audio file called HRY223 playing on your computer, along with accompanying visuals of several blueprints, including one of Lefty, one for a device called the Rask, one for the Scooper from Sister Location, and one for Molten Freddy that can only be seen in the files of the game and in the guidebooks. The cassette man we hear in other parts of the game, who is definitely Henry for reasons that should be pretty obvious, starts talking about how he's come to understand how depraved the creature that he unwillingly helped to create really is, and more about his history with the Fazbear brand. Let's listen to this audio recording in full so you have all the context.
It's only now that I understand the depth of the depravity of this creature, this monster that I unwillingly helped to create. As if what he had already done wasn't enough. He found a new way to desecrate, to humiliate, to destroy. As if the suffering wasn't enough, the loss of innocence, the loss of everything to so many people. Small souls trapped in prisons of my making, now set to new purpose, and used in ways I never thought imaginable. He lured them all back to a familiar place, back with familiar tricks. He brought them all together. Are they still aware? I hope not. It keeps me awake at night. I could make myself sleep, but not yet. Not until I undo what he has done and heal this wound. A wound first inflicted on me, but then one that I let bleed out to cause all of this. He set some kind of trap. I don't know what it was, but he led them there again. He overpowered them again, and he robbed them of the only thing that they had again. I don't know how those tiny breaths of life came to inhabit those machines, but they will never find rest now, not like this. I have to call them all back, all of them, together in one place.
First off, the depraved creature Henry brings up at the beginning of the recording is very clearly his former friend and partner, William Afton. What he did was obviously the multiple murder sprees he committed while he was still alive, and when Henry talks about prisons of his making now set to new purpose, he's talking about the original Freddy Fazbear animatronic mascots, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. The new purpose they were used for is William's experiments with Remnant and Eternal Life, which we see him set in motion in the Follow Me minigames where he steals the FNAF 1 gang's endoskeletons, luring the animatronics back to a familiar place, the back room, with familiar tricks, by telling them to follow him. It's these remnant experiments that lead him to take more and more lives, ultimately culminating in his death and later Henry finding out about Afton's return as Springtrap, which in turn leads to him creating the FNAF 6 pizzeria to end everything. Henry also brings up a wound first inflicted on me, which to me and to many others reads as something that Afton deliberately did to spite him, the murder of Henry's daughter, Charlotte Emily. Henry, in his grief, indirectly let the wound bleed out into everything that happened in the later locations, including all the shady practices, murders, and other crimes. In his final speech in FNAF 6's true ending, which I won't play because, let's be honest, most of you know it off by heart, the cassette man seems to be fully aware of how possession works, and the blueprints we see in the Insanity ending back this up, even showing the scooper, which at that point in the timeline only existed in the Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals bunker. So Henry obviously knows a lot about Fazbear Entertainment, the animatronics, and what William did, and the power of remnants and souls. But why did I start this video by claiming he could have been blamed for the most important set of murders in the franchise, and is there any evidence for this? First piece of evidence for this comes from a set of newspapers from the very first game. While playing Five Nights at Freddy's, if you look at the east hall corner, there's a low chance that the rules for safety taped to the wall will be replaced with one of 4 newspaper clippings detailing the timeline of the missing children incident where 5 children went missing at a Freddy's location. 2 of these newspapers in particular are interesting: Kids vanish at local pizzeria, bodies not found, and 5 children now reported missing, suspect convicted. Let's read both of them out. Kids vanish at local pizzeria, bodies not found. 2 local children were reportedly lured into a back room during the late hours of operation at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on the night of June 26. While video surveillance identified the man responsible and led to his capture the following morning, the children themselves were never found and are presumed dead. Police think the suspect dressed as a company mascot to earn the children's trust. 5 children now reported missing, suspect convicted. 5 children are now linked to the incident at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where a man dressed as a cartoon mascot lured them into a back room. While the suspect has been charged, the bodies themselves were never found. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been fighting an uphill battle ever since to convince families to return to the pizzeria. It's a tragedy. The second newspaper clipping uses 2 different words to describe what happened to the man after he was suspected of the murders: convicted and charged. While it's possible Scott didn't know these 2 words meant very different things, they very much do. To be convicted means to have been declared guilty of a criminal offense by the jury or a judge. In simple terms, that means that not only did our suspect go to court, but he lost. To be charged means to have been formally accused by a prosecutor of a certain crime. Yet again, in simple terms, this means our suspect went to court and was accused of certain crimes, in this case kidnapping and serial homicide, by a prosecuting attorney. In case you couldn't tell, these 2 words and their definitions are radically different and violently change the fate of the accused killer depending on which one's the case. So, which one is it? Well, I'm leaning more to the conviction of the suspect in this case, and this is where our good friend Henry Emily comes in. We all know that it was William Afton who actually did the missing children incident. It was Afton who killed them and hid their bodies. It was probably Afton who stuffed them into the suits, and it was Afton who set their souls to new purpose later on. I want to make it extraordinarily clear that I do not believe Henry Emily was the one who actually committed the incident. But what if he was blamed for the murders? In the Silver Eyes, we're told that the man who did the MCI was never caught because the bodies were never found, just like the newspapers tell us, but that William Afton and Henry Emily were the 2 prime suspects for a while after the killings, with a lot of the townsfolk suspecting mainly Henry for the murders. So what if in the game's universe, William shifted the blame to Henry for the killings? After all, William was wearing a yellow bunny suit while doing the MCI, meaning his face wouldn't have been shown on the security footage. This explains a lot about what happened to Henry between the missing children incident and FNAF 6, and neatly ties up the question about what those FNAF 1 newspapers actually mean looking back. Since the bodies were never found, the suspect, Henry, could only be charged with kidnapping, 5 counts of it to be exact. In the state of Utah, which is where most of the franchise's games take place, 1 count of kidnapping can be punished by upwards of 15 years in prison. Let's go safely in the middle and multiply 10 years by 5 children missing, which gets us 50 years. And if we compare this to the timeline we have of the games going forward, this doesn't line up perfectly. At all. 1985 is obviously the year the incident happened. Add 50 to 1985 and you get 2035, which, depending on the timeline you believe, could be the year security breach takes place, and Henry would probably be dead by this point anyway. But there's a catch. When the Fazbear's Fright attraction was opened, a bunch of Fazbear merchandise and antiques were brought into the new location, including the Springtrap animatronic. Obviously, Springtrap was never apprehended by the police, but if they were aware of the fact that Afton had died in that Spring Bonnie suit several years ago, they'd very quickly put 2 and 2 together. Afton was the one who wore that suit all the time, not Henry. And who knows, maybe they even found more evidence for him being the culprit of the missing children incident in those abandoned Freddy's buildings. So this leaves us with 2 options. Either Henry was released early for good behavior, as is fairly common, or evidence that absolved him of the crimes he was charged for was found, leading to his release. Whichever one of the 2 it is, he'd likely only be released around the time of FNAF 3. Now, the question becomes, is this what Scott Cawthon intended? Is it possible that Scott didn't know the difference between the words charged and convicted when writing those newspaper clippings? Absolutely. However, since he's never directly contradicted those newspapers, and since we're never told if this particular suspect was William Afton or not, I'm inclined to believe that Henry Emily was framed for the MCI by William, who laid out all the evidence to go against Henry. I made a video a couple weeks ago about the one FNAF retcon, where I covered the subject briefly and in passing, and I do want to make it clear in this video that no, I do not believe that this is the retcon. I believe that something else from FNAF 1 is the retcon. on, and if you want to find out what, I suggest you go watch that video. But anyway, as counter evidence for this idea, you might say it's not out of the question that Henry was the one who opened the FNAF 2 Freddy Fazbear's Pizza with the toys, and the upcoming FNAF 2 movie is making this possibility more and more likely. However, for now I'm inclined to believe it was neither William or Henry, but rather an anonymous third party who opened the second pizzeria. On the 5th night of FNAF 2, Phone Guy explains that Fazbear Entertainment is looking for the original owner of Fredbear's Family Diner. Phone Guy doesn't specify who this mysterious owner is. If Henry was in jail, they'd obviously have to be looking for William Afton. And since William had worked the day shift just a few days ago under a different name, that means he had to be undercover to get the job, implying either the company kicked both him and Henry out after the MCI, or that Henry isn't in jail and that he was the one who kicked William out. To be honest, this is my one big problem with this theory. It just feels too confusing and convoluted, with the dynamics between Henry, Emily, William Afton, and Fazbear Entertainment getting all muddled up. However, there is an answer that might fix this problem. We do see an anonymous CEO mentioned in both the FNAF 1 and FNAF 2 newspapers, and that person could totally be the one in charge of opening both locations. In the week before interactive novel, Ralph the Phone Guy is approached by a woman who seems to be the manager of the building, and is very clearly not William or Henry. Throughout the book, it's also mentioned that the FNAF 1 Freddy's is a reopened version of the FNAF 2 pizzeria with a much smaller building and budget. So if this is a reopening of the 1987 Freddy's being led by a third party, likely the CEO of the company, that means the FNAF 2 pizzeria was also opened and ran by someone who wasn't William or Henry. That explains why they're looking for the only owner still free, William Afton, who moved out of town shortly after the missing children incident. And this is why Henry was gone for so long up until the events of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. Okay, now that I've gone over all of the evidence, let me paint a picture of what happened to Henry and how he was framed, as a sort of Henry-Emily timeline, because this whole video is pretty confusing. Around the late 1970s, William Afton and Henry Emily opened Fredbear's Family Diner, and in 1983 they opened another location, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Henry, a genius engineer, builds the animatronics for both locations and helps William with the pizzerias, but in 1985, at the peak of the franchise's popularity, William kills 5 kids and stuffs them into the 4 main animatronics and Fredbear. Security footage captures a man wearing one of the Springlock suits, and since Henry's the engineer, the blame goes towards him. William quietly evades all scrutiny, and Henry is charged and convicted for 5 counts of child kidnapping, resulting in a life sentence. William disappears, which leads to the opening of 2 new locations by the new CEO of the company, the FNAF 2 and FNAF 1 locations. William comes back to work at the FNAF 2 location, killing 5 more kids, before disappearing yet again until he disassembles the FNAF 1 animatronics and dies in his own Springlock suit. Years later, the authorities either let Henry off for good behavior, or find evidence absolving him of the crime, maybe even William's corpse itself, which leads Henry Emily to creating the FNAF 6 pizzeria and ending it all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, even if it was a little bit confusing. I do agree that this wasn't the cleanest theory I've ever made, but it's definitely something interesting to think about. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed, and that will be all from me. Bye.